The morning was cold and quiet when the woman stepped off the bus near the old music hall. She paused for a moment, holding her coat tighter around herself, and looked at the tall building ahead. The stone walls looked serious, almost unwelcoming. Large glass doors reflected the gray sky. A banner hung above the entrance, announcing the piano audition that had drawn talented players from many places. She adjusted the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder and took a slow breath. Her shoes were simple, slightly scuffed from years of use. Her coat was clean but old-fashioned. Nothing about her stood out, and that was something she was used to. She had learned long ago how to blend into the background, how to move quietly through places where people rarely noticed her. Inside the hall, the air was warm and filled with soft sounds. Fingers ran across piano keys somewhere deep in the building. Voices echoed along the high ceilings. People stood in small groups, laughing, stretching their hands, or talking about difficult pieces they planned to play. Most of them looked confident. Their clothes were neat and stylish, and many carried expensive instrument cases even though pianos were already provided. The woman walked slowly toward the registration desk. As she waited in line, she listened. One person spoke about winning competitions. Another mentioned a famous teacher. Someone else joked about how easy this audition would be for them. She kept her eyes down, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned that silence often kept things simple. When it was her turn, she gently placed her papers on the desk. The volunteer barely looked up, quickly checking the list before sliding a number across the table. No smile, no question, no curiosity. Just a number and a short nod toward the waiting area. She thanked the volunteer quietly and moved to an empty chair near the wall. The seat was hard and cold, but she didn't mind. She placed her bag at her feet and folded her hands in her lap. Around her, the room buzzed with energy. Some people practiced quietly on small keyboards with headphones. Others whispered to friends, occasionally glancing in her direction. A few looks lingered longer than others. Not angry looks, not kind ones either. Just quick glances filled with judgment. Some eyebrows lifted slightly. Some lips curled into faint smiles. She noticed, but she didn't react. She had seen those looks many times before, in classrooms, at small events, even at past auditions where she was never taken seriously. Her thoughts drifted back to earlier mornings much like this one. Long days spent working simple jobs, saving small amounts of money, and practicing late at night when the world was quiet. Old pianos with stiff keys. Rooms where the sound barely carried. Moments when she wondered if anyone would ever truly listen. A door opened at the far end of the hall, and a staff member called the next number. A young player stood up confidently and walked toward the audition room. Applause followed from a few friends. The door closed again, and the waiting resumed. As time passed, performances echoed faintly through the walls. Some were fast and impressive, others careful and emotional. Each time someone returned, reactions followed. Smiles, laughter, disappointed sighs. The woman watched it all quietly, learning the mood of the room. When her number was finally called, there was a brief pause. She stood up slowly, smoothing her coat. A few nearby people glanced at her, surprised. One person leaned toward another and whispered something. A soft laugh followed. She walked toward the audition room with steady steps. Her heart beat faster, but her face remained calm. The staff member holding the door looked at her briefly, then motioned her inside. The room was smaller than the hall but still grand. A large piano sat in the center, polished and shining under bright lights. 3 judges sat behind a long table. Papers, pens, and water glasses were neatly arranged. They looked tired, their expressions neutral. She introduced herself simply and handed over her sheet music. One judge glanced at it, then at her, then back at the paper. Another judge nodded without expression. No questions were asked. No encouragement offered. She moved toward the piano bench and sat down carefully. The seat felt firm beneath her. She placed her hands on her knees and took a moment to breathe. In the silence, she could sense the room's low expectations. She had felt it many times before. From behind her, she could hear a quiet shuffle of papers. One judge checked a watch. Another leaned back slightly, arms crossed. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to focus. In her mind, the noise of the world faded. The whispers, the laughter, the long years of being overlooked, all of it softened. Her fingers hovered above the keys, not yet touching them. In that moment, she wasn't a plain woman in a simple coat. She was someone who had spent countless hours learning how to speak through sound. Before a single note was played, the room seemed to hold its breath. And that was how her audition began, not with applause or praise, but with quiet doubt hanging heavy in the air. The silence after she sat at the piano felt heavier than she expected. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was the kind filled with doubt, with people already deciding how things would end. She could sense it behind her, in the small movements of chairs and the soft clearing of throats. The judges waited, pens ready, not curious, just prepared to move on. She placed her hands gently on the keys, not playing yet. The piano felt different from the old ones she practiced on. The keys were smooth and light, responding even to the smallest touch. For a brief moment, she felt grateful. This piano could speak clearly if treated with care. Behind her, one judge leaned closer to another and whispered something. She didn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. The tone was familiar, carried low expectations, maybe even impatience. She took another slow breath. Her fingers rested, relaxed but ready. In her mind, memories surfaced. Not sharply, not painfully, just quietly. She remembered practicing late at night in small rooms where the walls were thin and the floor creaked. She remembered stopping mid-piece when someone knocked, asking her to keep the noise down. She remembered hands sore from long hours, and moments of doubt when she wondered if effort without recognition had any meaning. The judge closest to the piano cleared their throat. "You may begin," they said, their voice polite but distant. She nodded slightly. Her fingers moved. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant. A simple beginning. Nothing flashy. Nothing meant to impress quickly. A few people in the room shifted in their seats. Someone sighed quietly, already bored. She heard it all, but she stayed with the music. She always started this way, slowly, carefully, letting the sound settle before asking it to grow. The melody continued, gentle and controlled. It didn't rush. It didn't beg for attention. It spoke the way she had learned to speak, honestly, without decoration. The piano responded warmly, filling the room with a sound that felt closer than expected. One of the judges paused mid-note in their writing. Another lifted their head slightly. The change was subtle but real. The woman leaned into the music, her shoulders relaxing as the piece unfolded. Her fingers moved with confidence now, not loud, not fast, but certain. Each note connected smoothly to the next, forming something calm and steady. Outside the audition room, faint sounds of the waiting hall continued, but inside, those noises seemed to fade. The room narrowed to just the piano and the woman playing it. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't thinking about applause or scores. She was simply telling a story she had carried for years. The melody shifted. A deeper tone entered, carrying weight. It reflected long hours alone, choices made quietly, and dreams kept alive without encouragement. Her hands moved across the keys with ease that only came from patience, not pressure. A judge leaned forward, elbows now resting on the table. Another set their pen down completely. No one whispered anymore. The woman felt the change in the air. Not excitement yet. Something else. Tension. She allowed the music to grow slightly stronger. Not louder, just fuller. The notes filled the space, reaching corners of the room she hadn't expected. The piano seemed to respond eagerly, almost grateful to be played this way. Her face remained calm. Her eyes stayed focused on the keys, though she barely needed to look. Her hands knew where to go. They had traveled this path many times before. One judge glanced at the sheet music again, then back at her hands, confusion slowly replacing indifference. The piece continued to unfold, revealing layers. Soft moments followed by gentle strength. Pauses that spoke as clearly as sound. It wasn't a performance meant to impress quickly. It was one meant to be felt. The woman remembered being told once that her playing was too quiet, too emotional, not bold enough. She had listened politely back then. But over time, she learned that quiet did not mean weak. As the music deepened, something shifted inside the room. The doubt that had filled the silence earlier began to thin, like fog lifting slowly. A small mistake might have ended things for her in other auditions. But here, her playing was steady, honest, alive. Her fingers moved into a more complex section now, not rushed, but demanding focus. The notes flowed smoothly, each one clear. The judges watched closely, no longer expecting an end, but following the journey. For the first time since entering the building, the woman felt truly seen. Not as a person to judge by appearance, but as someone whose voice was finally being heard. She let the music rise gently, then pull back again. Like breathing, like life itself. One judge exchanged a glance with another. Their expressions were no longer bored or tired. They were alert, curious. The woman's hands slowed, easing toward a quiet moment in the piece. The sound softened, delicate but confident. Every note landed exactly where it needed to be. As she played, she felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the place where she belonged. Not the hall, not the judge's table, but this space between keys and sound. The final section of the piece approached, and she prepared for it carefully. Not rushing, not holding back. The last notes were gentle, lingering in the air longer than expected. When her fingers finally lifted from the keys, the sound faded slowly, like a thought finishing in the mind. For a moment no one moved. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't filled with doubt anymore. It was filled with surprise. The woman remained seated, hands resting lightly in her lap. She waited, not nervously, but patiently. One of the judges cleared their throat again, but this time, there was uncertainty in the sound. Another judge looked down, then back up at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Outside the room, the world continued as before. But inside, something had changed. And the audition was no longer what anyone expected it to be. The silence stretched longer than the woman expected. She stayed seated, breathing evenly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She had finished speaking through the piano, and now it was up to the room to respond. She had learned long ago not to rush moments like this. Silence often revealed more than words. One of the judges shifted in their chair and glanced at the others. Another judge picked up their pen again, then set it back down without writing. The third judge leaned forward slightly, eyes still fixed on the piano keys as if the sound might return on its own. "Thank you," one of them finally said. The words were simple, but the tone had changed. It was no longer distant or tired, carried careful respect. The woman nodded once and stood up slowly. She adjusted the bench back into place, a small habit she had picked up from years of practicing in shared spaces. Then she turned to face the judges, her expression calm and open. They asked her to wait for a moment. She stepped to the side of the room, standing quietly near the wall. From there, she could see their faces more clearly now. They were no longer looking past her. They were studying her. One judge asked where she had trained. The question was neutral, but there was curiosity behind it. She answered honestly. No famous schools. No well-known teachers. Mostly self-taught, with guidance from old books, borrowed recordings, and years of practice wherever she could find a piano. The judges exchanged looks again. One raised their eyebrows slightly. Another nodded, slowly. They asked how long she had been playing. She paused for a second, thinking. Felt strange to put it into words. She answered simply, saying she had started as a child and never really stopped. No one smiled politely this time. No one looked bored. One judge leaned back, considering her answer carefully. They thanked her again and told her she could step outside while they finished discussing. She nodded, picked up her bag, and left the room without a word. When the door closed behind her, the sounds of the waiting hall rushed back in. Conversations, laughter, nervous pacing. A few people looked up when she entered, some curious, some uninterested. She returned to the same chair by the wall and sat down. Her heart beat steadily now, not fast, not slow. She didn't feel excitement or fear. She felt something quieter. Relief. A person sitting nearby leaned toward a friend and whispered. Their eyes flicked toward her, then away. Another person glanced at her bag, her shoes, her coat, as if searching for something that explained what they had just heard through the door. She stared at the floor, listening. She had learned how to wait. Waiting had filled much of her life. As more auditions continued, she noticed the room felt different. The usual confidence of the other players seemed slightly shaken. Some practiced more urgently. Others stared at their hands, lost in thought. The staff member called the next number. Applause followed again, but it sounded thinner now. She thought back to earlier years, when moments like this had ended differently. Times when she played her heart out and still walked away unnoticed. Times when judges smiled kindly but offered nothing more. She had told herself after each one that it was enough to have played. Still, she couldn't deny that something about this moment felt different. After some time, a door opened and a judge stepped into the hall. They scanned the room briefly before calling her number again. The sound of it made a few heads turn. She stood up, surprised but composed, and followed them back into the audition room. The judges were standing now, no longer seated behind the table. Papers were spread out, but none were being written on. The mood was serious, but not cold. One judge explained that they would like to hear another piece. Something of her choosing. There were faint murmurs outside the door. Inside, the woman nodded slowly. She set her bag down again and returned to the piano bench. This time, there was no laughter, no whispers, only attention. She placed her hands on the keys once more. The piano felt familiar now, almost welcoming. She didn't close her eyes this time. She looked at the keys clearly, steady and focused. The first notes came quicker than before. Not rushed, but confident. The melody carried strength right from the beginning, as if answering a question that had been left hanging. The judges listened closely. One folded their hands together. Another tilted their head slightly, following the movement of her fingers. This piece was different, carried more energy, more movement. It spoke of resilience, of standing firm without raising one's voice. Her hands moved faster now, flowing across the keys with precision. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Each note landed cleanly, building momentum. She felt fully present, no longer aware of the room, the judges, or the people outside. Only the music existed. The sound filled the space completely. It wasn't overwhelming. It was controlled, intentional, alive. As the piece reached its peak, the woman allowed the music to rise boldly, then bring itself back down with grace. The contrast held the room in silence. When the final note ended, there was no pause this time. The judges stood still, stunned. One of them let out a slow breath, as if they hadn't realized they were holding it. Another shook their head quietly, almost in disbelief. The woman stood up once again and stepped back from the piano. She waited. One judge finally spoke, their voice steady but clearly affected. They thanked her for sharing her music. Not performing, sharing. They asked her to wait outside again. She nodded and left the room for the second time. The hall felt louder now, brighter somehow. More eyes followed her as she crossed the space. She sat back down, hands folded, posture relaxed. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. They were no longer mocking her. They were listening. The waiting felt longer this time. The woman sat quietly, her back straight against the chair, her bag resting at her feet. Around her, the room no longer ignored her presence. People tried not to stare, but their eyes returned to her again and again. Some whispered. Some stayed silent, pretending to practice while clearly listening for any sound from the audition room. She kept her gaze low, not out of fear, but habit. Attention was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. She had spent most of her life unnoticed, moving through days without being questioned or praised. Now even the air around her felt alert. The door to the audition room remained closed. Time passed slowly. A few numbers were called, then skipped. The schedule seemed to lose its rhythm. Staff members moved back and forth with quiet urgency. She thought about how easily this moment could have never happened. If she had stayed home. If she had convinced herself it wasn't worth trying. If she had listened to the many small voices over the years that told her she wasn't meant for places like this. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but inside, memories stirred. She remembered the first piano she ever touched. It wasn't shiny or new. Several keys were chipped, and one stuck if pressed too hard. It sat in a room that smelled faintly of dust and old paper. She had been small then, barely tall enough to see the keys properly. Someone had shown her where middle notes were, then left her alone. She had pressed one key, then another. The sound had filled something empty inside her. From that moment on, music became a quiet companion. It never judged her clothes or her background. It never asked where she came from or why she practiced alone. It simply responded. A soft cough pulled her back to the present. A staff member approached and told her the judges would like to speak with her again soon. Their tone was careful, respectful. She nodded and thanked them. Nearby, someone shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Another person sighed loudly. The confidence that once filled the room had thinned. Talent was no longer the only thing being measured. Now, uncertainty hung over everyone. The woman waited. When the door finally opened again, one of the judges stepped out and called her number for the third time. This time, there was no whispering. The room fell quiet as she stood. She walked back into the audition room with steady steps. The judges were seated again, but their posture had changed. They were upright, attentive. One offered her a chair near the table instead of sending her to the piano. She sat when invited, folding her hands gently. They began asking questions, not about competitions or awards, but about her life. How she practiced, where she found time, what music meant to her. She answered honestly, choosing her words carefully but simply. She spoke about long days and short nights, about practicing when others slept, about learning through listening, repeating, and failing quietly. She did not speak with bitterness. There was no anger in her voice, only truth. The judges listened without interrupting. One nodded slowly as she spoke. Another looked thoughtful, eyes lowered. They asked why she had come to the audition. She paused before answering. The question felt important. She said she came because she wanted to be heard. Not praised, not rewarded, just heard. The room remained silent after her words. One judge finally spoke, acknowledging that they had misjudged her at first. The honesty surprised her. They admitted that appearances had shaped expectations, even without intention. She listened calmly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. She had lived with those expectations her entire life. Hearing them spoken aloud did not shock her. The judge thanked her for reminding them why auditions existed in the first place. They told her they needed time to make final decisions, but that her performance had left a strong impression. She thanked them for the opportunity and stood to leave. As she walked out, the hall seemed to open around her. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed her again, but now the looks were different. There was curiosity, respect, even admiration. She returned to her chair one last time. Her heart felt full, not from pride, but from something deeper. Validation she had never demanded, finally arriving on its own. After a while, the auditions came to an end. The room slowly emptied as names were called and instructions given. Some people left smiling. Others left quietly, avoiding eye contact. The woman remained seated, waiting patiently. Eventually, a staff member approached her and handed her a small envelope. Inside was information about the next stage. No promises, no guarantees, just an invitation forward. She held the envelope carefully, as if it were fragile. She stood, placed her bag over her shoulder, and walked toward the exit. As she stepped outside, the cold air touched her face again. The sky had begun to clear. Pale sunlight slipped through the clouds, soft but warm. She paused at the top of the steps and looked back at the building. For the first time, it no longer felt unwelcoming. She didn't know what would come next. She didn't know if she would succeed or fail. But she knew something had changed. She had walked in unseen. She walked out remembered. The days that followed passed quietly, but they felt different to the woman. Life returned to its usual rhythm on the surface. She woke early, worked long hours, and practiced late at night when the world grew still. Yet something inside her had shifted. The audition stayed with her, not as a moment of pride, but as a gentle reminder that being heard was possible. She kept the envelope tucked safely inside her bag. She didn't open it every day. She didn't talk about it to anyone. She simply carried it with her, like a small promise she wasn't afraid to touch but didn't want to rush. When she practiced, her playing felt freer. Not louder or faster, just more open. The piano in the small room where she practiced was old and imperfect, but it responded faithfully. She treated it with the same care she had shown the grand piano at the audition. Music, after all, didn't change its value based on where it was played. Occasionally, her mind returned to the looks on the judges' faces, the moment when doubt had turned into attention. She didn't replay it for satisfaction. She replayed it to remember how quiet confidence could change a room. A few weeks later, a message arrived asking her to return for the next stage. The words were formal and brief. No praise, no excitement, just clear instructions. She read it once, then again. Her hands didn't shake. Her heart didn't race. She felt steady. On the day she returned, the building looked the same as before. Tall, serious, unchanged. But she was not the same person who had first walked through its doors. Inside, the atmosphere felt more controlled. Fewer people waited this time. Those who remained carried themselves carefully, aware that every detail mattered. Some recognized her. A few nodded politely. No one laughed. She took her seat and waited. When it was her turn, the room welcomed her with silence, not doubt. The judges greeted her by number again, but their voices carried recognition. She sensed it immediately. This time she was asked to perform alongside others, each given equal time. There was no whispering, no checking of watches. Everyone was given full attention. She listened to the other performers carefully. Each brought something different. Speed, precision, passion. She respected them all. When she sat at the piano again, she felt no need to prove herself. She chose a piece that spoke of endurance, of quiet strength that did not fade with time. Her fingers moved with ease, shaped by years of discipline rather than pressure. The music flowed naturally, filling the space without force. She let it breathe. The judges listened closely. They no longer watched her hands alone. They listened to the space between notes, to the intention behind the sound. When she finished, there was no applause. There didn't need to be. The silence carried understanding. After all the performances ended, the judges stepped away to deliberate. The waiting returned, but it felt lighter now. The woman sat calmly, her thoughts clear. She reminded herself that the outcome didn't define her. She had already gained something far more important, the knowledge that her voice mattered. When the judges returned, the room straightened. Names and numbers were called one by one. Some people smiled. Some looked disappointed but composed. When her number was finally spoken, it was followed by an invitation. A place in the program. An opportunity to continue. The words landed softly, but they stayed. She stood and accepted the information with a quiet nod. No tears. No visible excitement. Just gratitude. As she left the building once more, she felt the weight of the moment settle gently on her shoulders. It wasn't pressure. It was responsibility. In the weeks that followed, her life changed slowly, not suddenly. Lessons became more structured. Practice became deeper. Expectations grew, but so did her confidence. She struggled at times. There were moments of doubt, of exhaustion, of wondering if she truly belonged. But each time she sat at the piano, those thoughts faded. She learned alongside others, sharing space and sound. Some were surprised by her quiet nature. Others admired her focus. She didn't try to explain herself. Music did that for her. One evening, after a long practice session, she sat alone at the piano long after everyone else had left. The room was dim, the air still. She played softly, not preparing for anything, not performing, just remembering. She remembered the laughter, the whispers, the low expectations, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She realized that being underestimated had shaped her patience, her listening, her depth. It had never broken her. It had prepared her. As she closed the piano lid and gathered her things, she felt a quiet sense of peace. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer walking it unseen. Time passed, and the woman settled into her new routine. Days were fuller now, shaped by lessons, rehearsals, and quiet moments of reflection. The building that once felt distant had become familiar. The long hallways no longer intimidated her. She walked them with calm purpose, not rushing, not hiding. Her playing continued to grow, not because she tried to impress anyone, but because she listened more deeply. She listened to the piano, to other musicians, and to herself. Each session taught her something new, not only about music, but about patience and trust. There were challenges. Some days her fingers felt stiff. Other days her mind wandered, distracted by doubt. She questioned whether she truly belonged among people who had trained differently, who spoke confidently about technique and theory. But every time those thoughts rose, she returned to the keys. Sound grounded her. Gradually, others began to notice her in quiet ways. A classmate paused to listen when she practiced alone. An instructor offered a thoughtful suggestion, not out of obligation, but interest. No one spoke about the audition anymore. It no longer mattered. What mattered was consistency. One afternoon, a notice was placed on the board announcing a small public recital. Participation was optional but encouraged. The woman read the notice carefully. She felt no rush to sign her name. Performing for an audience was no longer about proving anything. Still, something inside her said yes. On the evening of the recital, the hall filled slowly. Friends, families, and a few strangers took their seats. The atmosphere was warm, supportive. Nothing like the tension of the audition months before. The woman waited backstage, listening as others played. Each performance was met with applause. Some were confident, others nervous, all sincere. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage without hesitation. The lights were soft, not harsh. The piano waited at the center, familiar and steady. She sat down and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, she remembered the first day she had walked into this world, carrying nothing but hope and years of quiet practice. She remembered the laughter, the doubt, the silence that once felt heavy. Then she began to play. The music flowed gently, filling the room with warmth. It was not dramatic or loud. It was honest. Each note carried the weight of experience, shaped by patience rather than ambition. The audience listened closely. Some leaned forward. Some closed their eyes. The sound wrapped around them, steady and calm. She played as she always had, speaking through the piano in the only way she knew how. There was no fear now, only presence. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was peaceful. Then applause rose, not thunderous, but sincere and sustained. She stood and bowed briefly, her expression calm. As she left the stage, she felt something settle inside her. Not relief, not pride, completion. After the recital, people approached her quietly. A few thanked her for the music. One said it reminded them of something they had forgotten. Another simply smiled and nodded. She accepted the kindness with grace, never overstaying a moment. Later that night, she walked home under a clear sky. The city sounds felt softer. Her steps were light. She thought about how easily she could have turned back on that first audition day. How close she had come to staying invisible. She realized then that the real change had not been how others saw her, but how she saw herself. She no longer measured her worth by reaction or recognition. She measured it by honesty. In the weeks and months that followed, her path continued forward. There were more performances, more learning, more quiet victories that never made headlines. She remained plain in appearance, simple in manner. She did not change herself to match expectations. But when she sat at a piano, people listened. Not because she demanded attention, but because she had learned how to give something real. The woman who had once been mocked became known not for her past, but for her voice. And that voice, shaped by silence and patience, would stay with those who heard it long after the sound faded.